Few criminal cases in American history have captured the public's imagination quite like that of the Zodiac Killer. Operating primarily in Northern California in the late 1960s, this unknown assailant is linked to multiple murders, though he claimed even more, and became notorious for sending cryptic letters and ciphers to local newspapers. The blend of brutality, taunting communications, and enduring mystery around the killer's identity has transformed the Zodiac into a near mythic figure in the annals of true crime. Unlike some contemporaneous killers, the Zodiac reveled in publicity. He orchestrated a campaign of fear through letters brimming with chilling threats and bizarre codes. Even decades later, the ciphers remain a subject of intense debate among amateur sleuths, cryptographers, and law enforcement enthusiasts. The killer's brazen contact with the media helped him outlast many other criminals in the public conscience, largely because he was never definitively identified or brought to trial. This text offers a thorough exploration of the Zodiac Killer's reign of terror. We will begin by placing his crimes in the socio-historical context of late 1960s America, a turbulent era marked by civil unrest, the Vietnam War, and countercultural movements that often overshadowed local crime stories. We will then detail the known murders attributed to the Zodiac, highlighting the unique aspects of each crime scene and the aftermath. From there, we will delve into the killer's infamous letters and ciphers, examining how they shaped both the investigation and the lore surrounding the case. Central to understanding the Zodiac's sustained impact is an analysis of the psychology behind his actions. We will explore potential motives, personality traits, and the possibility of early life influences that might have contributed to his development into a lethal, attention-seeking predator. In doing so, we draw upon established psychological theories about serial offenders and consider the complexities that arise when a killer appears to relish the media spotlight. The case also saw major investigative efforts by multiple law enforcement agencies, most notably the Vallejo Police Department, the Napa County Sheriff's Office, and the San Francisco Police Department. The difficulties faced, ranging from jurisdictional competition to technological limitations, shed light on the broader challenges of serial killer investigations in a pre-digital era. We will examine the suspects who have emerged over time, some more credible than others, as well as modern forensics that have re-examined evidence in search of DNA or ballistic confirmation. Finally, we will discuss the Zodiac Killer's profound cultural impact, not just on the region's sense of safety and trust, but also on popular culture, from Hollywood dramatizations to endless online communities devoted to cracking the ciphers and unmasking the perpetrator. The mystery endures, raising enduring questions about the nature of evil, the role of the media in amplifying violence, and the vulnerabilities in our criminal justice system. Before diving into the historical backdrop, it's important to note that much of what we know about the Zodiac remains incomplete or contested. As with many unsolved cases, contradictory testimonies, unreliable memories, and incomplete police records complicate attempts to create a definitive account. Nevertheless, by reviewing the key events, analyzing available evidence, and considering the psychological dimension, we can begin to form a clearer picture of one of the 20th century's most elusive killers. In the end, the Zodiac Killer reminds us that uncertainty fuels fascination. Devoid of a confirmed face or legal resolution, the story invites endless speculation, a testament to humankind's desire to comprehend what lies behind acts of seemingly motiveless cruelty. Yet it also underscores the harsh reality that justice can be elusive, and that some criminals manage to manipulate both their victims and the public at large in ways that linger for decades. With that, let us step back in time to 1960s California and trace the menacing footsteps of the Zodiac. Part 2. Historical context and setting to fully appreciate how the Zodiac Killer captivated public attention. One must understand the socio-political landscape of the United States in the late 1960s. This period was a watershed moment in American history, marked by seismic cultural shifts and widespread unrest. Against a backdrop of the Vietnam War, the civil rights movement, and the emerging counterculture, traditional institutions were being questioned, and the media played a more prominent role than ever before in shaping national discourse. California's cultural mosaic, California, in the 1960s, was a microcosm of America's broader transformations. San Francisco, in particular, had become a magnet for the counterculture. The Haight-Ashbury district drew young people seeking liberation from conservative norms, experimenting with new forms of music, art, and lifestyle. Meanwhile, Hollywood continued to churn out movies that reflected or sometimes fueled social changes. Northern California had its own diverse socio-economic aliasings. Suburban neighborhoods coexisted with bustling cities, while rural expanses were dotted throughout. These differences often presented challenges for law enforcement agencies, which could vary significantly in their resources and approaches. Rise of media sensationalism. By the late 1960s, newspapers, television, and radio had the capacity to disseminate information at unprecedented speeds. High-profile crimes quickly dominated headlines, with sensational reporting becoming a norm. The Zodiac Killer exploited this trend. Where previous killers might have shunned publicity, the Zodiac actively courted it by sending letters to newspapers like the San Francisco Chronicle, the cultural climate of the time, where political assassinations, such as those of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy, had already shocked the nation. meant that stories of random violence loomed larger and felt even more destabilizing, changing law enforcement paradigms. Another crucial element of the late 1960s environment was the state of American policing. While advances had been made in forensic science, fingerprinting, ballistics, and other investigative techniques, cooperative, centralized databases for criminal information were still rudimentary. Communication between different jurisdictions was often sluggish and hampered by bureaucratic hurdles. This would prove critical in the Zodiac case, where crimes spanned multiple counties. Coordinated investigations were possible, but not without friction. Moreover, the concept of a serial killer was not yet as clearly defined in the public consciousness as it would become in subsequent decades. Vallejo, Benicia, and surrounding areas, the Zodiac's first confirmed murders took place in the suburban and semi-rural areas around Vallejo and Benicia, located northeast of the San Francisco Bay. These areas housed a mix of working class and middle-class families. Many were employed at nearby military bases, factories, or businesses. Young couples often visited quiet lovers' lanes and secluded spots near Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs Park, places that would become infamous once the Zodiac chose them for his attacks. A society on edge tensions were already high. Youthful rebellion against traditional values, combined with the threat of the Vietnam War draft, created a climate in which violent acts, whether political or random, generated extraordinary fear. It was in this crucible of societal upheaval that the Zodiac Killer emerged. Striking without obvious motive, he represented the worst nightmares of a generation already questioning the moral fabric of their nation. If political assassinations seemed targeted, the Zodiac's random violence felt incomprehensible, feeding a collective anxiety that reverberated well beyond California. From this vantage point, one can see how a series of murders, violent and shocking as they were, became a national story. The Zodiac's methodical approach, cryptic letters, and penchant for publicity meshed all too well with a media culture primed for sensational headlines. Next, we will turn to the specifics of the Zodiac's attacks, tracing his movements and the subsequent investigations that attempted, and thus far failed, to conclusively identify him. Part 3G. The murders. The Zodiac Killer is definitively linked to 5 murders, though he claimed responsibility for more. These confirmed attacks spanned from December 1968 to October 1969. Each incident bore certain hallmarks, yet they also showcased an evolving approach to murder that left investigators struggling to predict his next move. Lake Herman Road. December 20, 1968. The Zodiac's first confirmed attack took place along Lake Herman Road, near the city of Benicia. High school students Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday had driven to a secluded lover's lane. At some point that night, an assailant approached their vehicle. Evidence suggests that the couple was forced out of the car before being shot. Betty Lou died at the scene, and David succumbed to his wounds en route to the hospital. Investigators found shell casings from a .22 caliber weapon. There was little evidence to indicate a robbery or sexual assault, leaving the motive unclear. At first, the murders were seen as a tragic but isolated incident. However, in hindsight, Lake Herman Road marked the beginning of a pattern on an attack on a couple in a secluded area, carried out swiftly and leaving little physical evidence. Blue Rock Springs, July 4, 1969. The second confirmed Zodiac attack occurred on the outskirts of Vallejo, just a few miles from Lake Herman Road. Darlene Furin and Mike Majau parked at the Blue Rock Springs golf course parking lot. A vehicle pulled up behind them, then drove away, only to return minutes later. The driver exited with a flashlight and began shooting into the car. Ferrin was hit multiple times and died shortly afterward. Majau survived despite severe gunshot wounds. This attack introduced a macabre twist approximately 40 minutes after the shooting. The Vallejo Police Department received a phone call from someone claiming responsibility. He not only took credit for this incident, but also referenced the earlier Lake Herman Road murders, stating, "I also killed those kids last year." Tracing the call led police to a phone booth near a gas station. But the killer was gone by the time officers arrived. Lake Berryessa, September 27, 1969. In late September 1969, college students Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were picnicking on the shores of Lake Berryessa in Napa County. A man wearing a bizarre hooded costume approached, brandishing a gun and knife. He claimed to be an escaped convict in need of their car. The assailant proceeded to bind both victims with pre-cut lengths of plastic clothesline, then savagely stabbed them. Before fleeing, he scrawled a coded message and a crossed circle symbol on Hartnell's car door, along with the dates of the previous Zodiac attacks. Cecilia Shepard was gravely injured and died 2 days later in the hospital. Brian Hartnell, however, survived, providing a detailed description of the attacker. The use of a costume marked a striking departure from the previous approach, suggesting that the Zodiac was growing more theatrical. The killer even phoned the Napa County Sheriff's Office later that evening to report the double stabbing, directing police to the scene. Presidio Heights, October 11, 1969. Roughly 2 weeks later, the Zodiac killed 29-year-old taxi driver Paul Stein in the Presidio Heights neighborhood of San Francisco. Unlike the earlier attacks on couples, this incident took place in a well-to-do urban area, raising speculation that the killer was altering his methods or finalizing some personal agenda. The murderer shot Stein once in the head and tore away a portion of the victim's shirt, which would later surface in Zodiac's letters to prove authenticity. witnesses, including teenagers who observed the incident from a nearby home, described seeing a white male wiping the cab down before walking away. A miscommunication in the police dispatched lead officers to look for a suspect of a different race, allowing the real killer to slip past a patrol car. This brazen murder in the heart of San Francisco spurred a massive manhunt and introduced the Zodiac's rampage to a major urban center. Possible additional victims. The Zodiac claimed responsibility for as many as 37 murders, and investigators have considered several possible additional victims. For example, the 1963 murders of Robert Domingos and Linda Edwards in Southern California share similarities but lack definitive links. Cherry Joe Bates, killed in 1966 near Riverside, was also floated as a potential victim. However, none of these have been conclusively tied to the Zodiac, underlining the tenuous nature of attributing crimes to an individual who so openly boasted of unconfirmed kills. These confirmed murders revealed a killer who seemed to blend cruelty with a troubling desire for attention. In each case, he left behind clues: shell casings, phone calls, scribbled messages that showed a fascination with exerting control over the narrative. As the body count mounted, the Zodiac began communicating directly with the media, a calculated effort to stoke public fear and ensure he remained in the spotlight. It is to these letters and ciphers that we now turn. Part forged letters, ciphers, and media taunting. Arguably, the Zodiac Killer's greatest weapon was not a firearm or a knife, but rather his pen. Between 1969 and 1974, he penned numerous letters to local newspapers, most famously the San Francisco Chronicle. These letters frequently included coded messages, which he claimed contained his identity. While some ciphers have been solved, others remain elusive, contributing to the lasting aura of mystery. The first letters on July 31, 1969, just weeks after the Blue Rock Springs attack. 3 nearly identical letters arrived at the Vallejo Times-Herald, the San Francisco Chronicle, and the San Francisco Examiner. Each letter took credit for the attacks on Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs, and each included 1/3 of a cipher. The killer demanded that the newspapers print the ciphers on their front pages, threatening to go on a weekend killing spree if they refused. The cipher consisted of 408 characters. Amateur codebreakers Donald and Betty Hardin famously cracked this first cipher in August 1969. The plain text revealed a rambling message referencing the killer's pleasure in hunting humans, comparing it to hunting wild game in the forest. Notably, the decrypted text did not include his identity, contradicting the killer's claim that it did. The Zodiac moniker emerges on August 4, 1969. The San Francisco Examiner received another letter beginning with the now iconic phrase, "This is the Zodiac speaking." From this point forward, he would be known as the Zodiac Killer, The letter included additional details about the murders that only the true perpetrator could have known, further cementing the link between the letters and the crimes. The 340 cipher in November 1969, the Zodiac mailed a more complex cipher, often referred to as the 340 cipher due to its length. This coded message baffled both law enforcement and amateur cryptographers for decades. It wasn't until 2020 that a team of code breakers, David Oranchak, Jarl Van Eyck, and Sam Blake, announced they had solved it using a combination of computational and manual cryptanalysis. The decrypted text contained a vaguely coherent message referencing illusions of an afterlife, though it again omitted a clear confession of identity. Taunts and threats beyond the ciphers. The Zodiac's letters bristled with taunts and threats. He mocked the police for their inability to catch him, offered clues about future crimes, and even claimed he was collecting slaves for the afterlife. His letters sometimes included diagrams or instructions reflecting a twisted showmanship. On occasion, he enclosed physical evidence, such as a piece of Paul Stein's bloodied shirt, to verify his authenticity. In one letter, he declared, "I am not afraid of the gas chamber," implying that he was willing to continue killing without fear of consequences. The tone oscillated between cunning theatrics and delusional fantasies. Some letters demanded that citizens wear Zodiac themed buttons to prevent attacks, a bizarre request that underscored his hunger for public attention. In other communications, the Zodiac threatened to blow up school buses, preying on the region's fear for children's safety. The media's role. The letters generated intense media coverage, which in turn fed the Zodiac's desire for notoriety. Headlines splashed across newspapers, and television broadcasts analyzed every fresh communication. Editors debated whether printing the ciphers and letters would encourage further violence or help police gather clues. In many ways, the Zodiac manipulated the press as deftly as he evaded the authorities. He thrived on the interplay between fear and public fascination. Ongoing enigma. Although some letters are widely accepted as authentic, others remain contested. The Zodiac occasionally claimed crimes that could not be substantiated, and multiple Hawks letters further muddied the waters. Nonetheless, the communications remain a defining feature of the case, underscoring how a serial killer can harness the media to heighten terror and carve a place in criminal folklore. These letters, teeming with arrogance and cryptic allusions, not only showcased the Zodiac's intelligence, but also exposed a profound need for control. By orchestrating a public spectacle, he transformed typical police-citizen dynamics. He became the star of his own deadly drama, with society as a captive audience. This set the stage for a sprawling police investigation that, despite considerable effort, never pinned down the killer's identity. Part 5, The Police Investigation, hunting the Zodiac Killer posed an extraordinary challenge for California law enforcement agencies. Though dedicated officers and detectives worked tirelessly, they faced the confounding nature of a killer who left few direct clues and frequently changed tactics. Overlapping jurisdictions and limited forensic capabilities further complicated matters. Vallejo and Benicia authorities. Initially, local police departments in Vallejo and Benicia took the lead after the attacks at Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs. Detectives interviewed friends of the victims, combed the crime scenes for evidence, and collected shell casings. Still, the lack of eyewitnesses or clear motives stymied the investigation. Once the Zodiac called police to claim responsibility, the tenor of the inquiry changing this was no random spree. A serial killer was on the loose, and he had escalated from threats to confirmed kills. Napa County Sheriff's Department. The Lake Berryessa attack propelled the Napa County Sheriff's Department into the fray. Sheriff's deputies found the ominous message on Brian Hartnell's car door, listing the dates of prior Zodiac murders. This rare physical evidence, along with Hartnell's eyewitness account, opened fresh leads. Yet, the suspect's hooded costume announced motive, and willingness to linger at the scene introduced a new dimension of psychological terror. While sheriff's investigators followed up with local suspects, no arrests materialized. The Zodiac's method: ambushing couples, then phoning authorities, seemed carefully planned to avoid detection. San Francisco Police Department SFPD Paul Stein's murder in Presidio Heights catapulted the case into a new realm. Homicide inspectors from the San Francisco Police Department, including Dave Toschi and Bill Armstrong, took the lead. The killer had ventured into a densely populated city, underscoring his audacity. Despite multiple eyewitness accounts and physical evidence, fingerprints found on the cab, the SFPD could not make a definitive identification. The bungled dispatch. Officers mistakenly looking for a black suspect allowed the real perpetrator to slip away. This error haunts the investigation's history. It could have been the moment to catch the Zodiac in the act. Collaboration and complications. A major obstacle was interagency communication. Although cooperation existed, for instance, the Department of Justice in Sacramento kept files and records from each locale. Bureaucratic rivalries and the sheer scope of the search hampered seamless coordination. Information sharing was often slow, reliant on mailed reports or phone calls. The absence of modern digital databases meant that investigative leads could languish if not properly followed through by the receiving department. Additionally, the Zodiac's letters frequently surfaced in different newspapers, requiring an investigative approach that transcended local boundaries. The FBI provided some assistance, particularly in analyzing ciphers and letters for forensic clues. Yet the case never reached the threshold for a full federal takeover. Forensic limitations, forensic science in the late 1960s and early 1970s offered basic tools like ballistic matching, fingerprint analysis, and blood typing. DNA profiling was still decades away. The partial fingerprints lifted from Paul Stein's cab were inconclusive. The shell casings from the first murders linked some of the attacks, but the killer's identity remained elusive. Investigators did attempt to glean DNA from the envelopes and stamps used in the letters, but the technology did not exist to properly process such samples then. Modern efforts to extract DNA have been inconclusive due to contamination or insufficient genetic material. Lingering obstacles despite exhaustive interviewing and thousands of tips. The Zodiac was never conclusively identified. The suspect generated numerous composite sketches, but none yielded the definitive lead. Investigators found themselves chasing rumors, dead ends, and false confessions. The killer's pattern of contacting the press rather than leaving predictable crime scenes made him a challenge for typical investigative methods, which relied on checking known offenders or analyzing repeated behaviors. The police did not stand idle. They worked relentlessly within the constraints of the era. Yet the Zodiac's cunning, combined with the sporadic timing and geographic spread of the murders, consistently outpaced the official response. What followed was the emergence of suspects, some plausible, others speculative, as well as a robust community of amateur detectives determined to unmask the infamous killer. Part 6. Key Suspects over the decades. Law enforcement and amateur sleuths have put forth a myriad of suspects for the Zodiac Killer. While some stood out due to circumstantial evidence, none were definitively linked via conclusive forensics. Here, we explore a few of the more prominent suspects and the rationales behind their suspicion. Arthur Leigh. Alan Arthur Allen remains the most well-known suspect, largely due to investigations by both the police and journalist Robert Graysmith. Author of Zodiac. Allen was a Valito resident who attracted police attention in the early 1970s. Several pieces of circumstantial evidence pointed in his directioning. A friend reported that Allen spoke of wanting to kill couples at random. He owned a watch by the brand Zodiac, featuring the same crossed circle symbol. He matched certain physical descriptions offered by surviving victims. The police found weapons at his home, though none definitively tied him to the Zodiac crimes. Despite these clues, Allen's fingerprints did not match those lifted from Paul Stein's taxi, and handwriting analysis on Zodiac letters did not conclusively match. While multiple detectives long suspected Allen, he passed away in 1992 without being charged. Lawrence Kane Lawrence. Laurie Kane was another suspect considered by investigators. He had a criminal record and, at times, lived in close proximity to the Zodiac crime scenes. Darlene Ferrin's sister claimed to have seen Kane in the vicinity, and a retired police detective argued Kane's name might appear in one of the Zodiac ciphers. However, no definitive link was established, and Kane's alleged involvement relies on anecdotal connections rather than hard evidence. Richard Gakowski worked for a San Francisco counterculture newspaper, raising suspicions that he could have knowledge of editorial processes and letter correspondence. Some claim he physically resembled the composite sketch of the Zodiac. Additionally, an audio recording of Gajkowski's voice was said to match a tipster who once called into a TV show, though voice identifications can be highly subjective. Again, the tangible evidence tying Gajkowski to the crimes remains tenuous. Earl Van Best Jader Gary Stewart, in his book The Most Dangerous Animal of All, 2014, posited his biological father, Earl Van Best Jader, as the Zodiac Killer. Stewart's evidence includes handwriting comparisons, partial name matches in Zodiac ciphers, and alleged facial similarities to the composite sketches. Handwriting experts disputed these claims, and official investigators found the evidence insufficient for a definitive conclusion. Other theories and outliers beyond these primary suspects, a litany of alternative theories abound. Some suggest the Zodiac was a transient or drifter, which would explain the diverse crime scenes and lack of personal connections. A few hypotheses even propose that the Zodiac spree was a group effort or part of a larger conspiracy. The Riverside killing of Cheery Joe Bates in 1966 introduced another suspect pool altogether, though formal connections to the Zodiac remain inconclusive. No smoking gun, one of the most frustrating aspects for both investigators and the public is the absence of a smoking gun. In many serial killer cases, new technology, particularly DNA profiling, eventually cracks the puzzle, while genealogical DNA databases have solved cold cases from the same era, such as the Golden State Killer. No definitive match has emerged for the Zodiac. Occasional announcements of breakthroughs garner headlines, but often fizzle once tested against the rigors of scientific validation. In the tapestry of Zodiac theories, Arthur Lee Allen stands out as the perennial favorite. But his guilt is far from proven. The swirl of speculation underscores the paradox of high-profile unsolved crimes. The more theories proliferate, the more the public yearns for a tidy resolution. The killer's ability to remain a cipher, both literally and figuratively, has kept the Zodiac at the forefront of true crime lore. Next, we delve into the psychology that might explain the killer's motives, from childhood influences to potential mental disorders. Part 7. Psychological analysis are attempting to profile the Zodiac Killer demands an exploration of the behaviors and communications he demonstrated. Modern psychological and criminological frameworks provide some insight, even if we lack the definitive background or forensic interviews that might confirm such theories. Narcissism and grandiosity. The Zodiac's method of contacting media outlets and demanding front-page publication suggests a strong streak of narcissism. He relished the public's fear and sought recognition for his crimes. Such behavior is consistent with an offender who craves control and validation. By positioning himself as an almost omnipotent figure, the Zodiac revealed in an inflated sense of importance. A hallmark of pathological narcissism. Antisocial personality traits. Serial killers often exhibit traits associated with antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, lack of remorse, deceitfulness, aggression, and disregard for the safety of others. The Zodiac's killing sprees and subsequent mocking letters reflect a profound lack of empathy. Even when providing details about the murders, he did so with chilling detachment, threatening to bomb school buses or randomly select more victims further underscores a callous disregard for human life. Control and dominance control is central to many serial offenders. The Zodiac meticulously planned certain attacks. Yeji, Lake Berryessa, bringing cut rope to bind victims. He also exercised psychological control over entire communities, evidenced by his media manipulation. By controlling the narrative, sending letters, ciphers, and threats, he fed off the region's terror. This sense of power may have been an end in itself, beyond any sexual or financial motive. Childhood trauma or developmental factors. Without a confirmed identity, we can only speculate on the killer's upbringing. However, many violent offenders share histories of abuse, neglect, or other adverse childhood experiences. This can manifest in a distorted worldview where empathy fails to develop normally. If the Zodiac faced formative traumas, it might have contributed to the twisted worldview evident in his letters. In many serial killer cases, such as Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy, some combination of dysfunctional family environments, mental health struggles, and deep-seated resentments often emerge. While no direct evidence has pinned such a background on any Zodiac suspect, it remains a plausible dimension. Pattern of escalation often. Serial killers escalate their behaviors, both in violence and in the lengths they go to draw attention. Zodiac's progression from random gun violence to binding and stabbing at Lake Berryessa, then culminating in the brazen murder of a taxi driver in San Francisco, suggests a willingness to evolve or experiment with risk levels. Each time, he followed up with letters that boasted of his actions, intensifying the psychological game. The role of fantasy plays a crucial role for many serial offenders. They rehearse and refine imagined scenarios, seeking the perfect crime. The Zodiac's symbolic references, like the crossed circle symbol and elaborate ciphers, can be interpreted as ritualistic elements that satisfied an internal fantasy. he named himself after a concept, the zodiac, that implies cosmic significance, possibly reflecting a personal delusion of grandeur. Possible motive, attention, seeking, or ideological. Where some killers harbor ideological motives, Ni-Ji, son of Sam, claimed demonic possession, while others target specific groups. The Zodiac's claims to collect slaves for the afterlife seemed more like grandiose posturing than a coherent belief system. He might have relished the chaos and fear he provoked, finding gratification in the way the public and the media treated his crimes as an ongoing spectacle. Psychological enigma, in sum, the Zodiac emerges as a psychological enigmag, a cunning and organized offender who orchestrated carefully staged murders, followed by chaotic and taunting letters. The stark lack of empathy, paired with a hunger for fame or notoriety, suggests a blend of narcissistic, antisocial, and possibly paranoid traits, while the ultimate root of his behavior remains hidden without a confirmed identity. Examining the known patterns highlights the darkness that can emerge in individuals who seek power through violence and manipulation. Crucially, this profile is limited by the incomplete data we have. Investigators and profilers today rely on consistent patterns, victimology, and forensic evidence to craft a psychological portrait. The Zodiac's unpredictability, evolving methods, and cryptic persona make him harder to categorize neatly. Nevertheless, the broad outlines of his personality, grandiose, controlling, and utterly remorseless, are unmistakable. Part 90G, Societal and Cultural Impact. The Zodiac Killer's influence went far beyond the immediate horror of the murders. His effect on law enforcement practices, media culture, and public consciousness remains evident even decades later. In some respects, the Zodiac presaged the modern phenomenon of high-profile serial killers who become embedded in popular lore. Heightened fear and community vigilance. In the immediate aftermath of the murders, Northern California residents found themselves in a state of heightened vigilance. Couples were wary of secluded lovers' lanes. Drivers eyed suspicious vehicles. Parents were terrified by the Zodiac's threats against school children. The sense of random, motiveless danger shook communities, unaccustomed to such brazen violence. This fear also drove increased gun purchases and the formation of neighborhood watch groups, as civilians realized the killer could strike anyone, anywhere. Media and the killer celebrity. The Zodiac exemplified the emergence of the killer as celebrity. By manipulating the media to print his letters and ciphers, he became a household name. Newspapers capitalized on the public's fascination, running banner headlines and daily updates. Radio and television news segments joined in, fueling speculation. The notion of a criminal actively seeking the spotlight laid groundwork for subsequent cases. Chi-G, the BTK killer in Wichita, where perpetrators wrote letters to the press for attention and notoriety. Influence on policing techniques. At an institutional level, the Zodiac case helped underscore the need for better communication among law enforcement agencies. Inter-county and statewide task forces gained traction in subsequent decades, recognizing that criminals often cross jurisdictional boundaries. Although lacking a definitive resolution, the investigation catalyzed greater emphasis on suspect profiling and improved forensic analysis. The shortcomings exposed by the case, like the inaccurate bolo. B. On the lookout description in the Presidio Heights murder became cautionary tales taught in police academies. Unrelenting amateur investigation. The Zodiac case birthed a massive community of amateur investigators, known collectively as Zodiologists. They comb through original police reports, compare handwriting samples, and attempt to decrypt unsolved ciphers. Online forums dedicated to the Zodiac have existed since the early days of the Internet, reflecting a digital age extension of the search for answers. This robust amateur involvement is akin to that seen with Britain's Jack the Ripper or the JonBenét Ramsey murder. Cases where official solutions never quite satisfied public curiosity. Popular culture, books, films, and more inevitably. The Zodiac Killer was immortalized in popular culture. Robert Graysmith's books, Zodiac, Zodiac Unmasked, brought the case to a new generation, asserting that Arthur Leigh Allen was the prime suspect. Hollywood's take included films like Dirty Harry, 1971, which featured a villain loosely based on the Zodiac, and David Fincher's Zodiac, 2007. A meticulous portrayal of the investigation that re-energized public interest. References to the Zodiac appear in music, television shows, graphic novels, and even video games, ensuring his infamy transcends time. Enduring fascination, the case's unfinished nature, is a key reason for its lasting grip on the public imagination. Even as decades pass, new technologies spark hope that some artifact, a partial DNA sample, a long-lost piece of the puzzle, will finally crack the mystery. Each failed lead or inconclusive test only deepens the sense of an enduring enigma. Some see the Zodiac as a cautionary figure, reminding us that not all criminals are caught, and that fear can become a tool wielded by those hungry for attention. In all these ways, the Zodiac transcends the category of a mere serial killer. He stands as a symbol of unbridled evil lurking in the shadows of everyday life. An icon of unsolved crime that underscores both the power and the limitations of modern law enforcement. Perhaps more than anything, the societal impact reveals how thoroughly violence can infiltrate collective consciousness, shaping everything from local safety measures to cultural products like books and films. Finally, the Zodiac Killer case epitomizes many of the darkest fascinations within the realm of true crime. From his random acts of violence against unsuspecting couples to his cryptic letters that held an entire region in thrall. The Zodiac cast a long shadow over Northern California in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The tale is one of brutality and brazen taunting, but also of resiliency. Communities rallied. Law enforcement adapted, and amateur detectives kept the flame of inquiry alive for over half a century. This legacy is complex and interwoven with broader cultural factors. The late 1960s was a period already rife with national turmoil. Against a backdrop of anti-war protests and civil rights activism, the Zodiac's murders stood as a grim reminder that violence could erupt in any setting, targeting anyone. His methods: ambushing couples in romantic retreats or killing a taxi driver in a well-off neighborhood, destroyed the illusion of safety. He seemed to embody the era's worst anxieties, a figure who reveled in chaos and used mass media as his personal stage. Psychologically, the Zodiac remains an enigma. He appeared cunning, organized, and comfortable taunting the authorities, which indicates a structured mindset. Yet, his claims about collecting slaves for the afterlife might point to delusions or a deeply ingrained fantasy life. Without a confirmed identity or psychological evaluation, we can only draw parallels to known criminal typologies: narcissistic, antisocial, and perhaps psychopathic. The possibility of childhood trauma or chronic social alienation hovers in the background, as it does in many cases of extreme violence. The case also spotlights significant challenges in law enforcement. Investigative silos and limited technology during the 1960s and 1970s hindered the quest to apprehend the Zodiac. While ballistic matches confirmed the links between certain shootings, the killer's ability to adapt kept him steps ahead. His practice of revealing crimes through phone calls and letters, alongside manipulation of the press, highlights how thoroughly he controlled the narrative. In modern times, advanced DNA techniques have cracked numerous cold cases. Yet, the Zodiacs remain stubbornly unresolved, possibly due to lost evidence, contamination, or the killer's own cunning. Yet, as much as the Zodiac's reign was about terror, it also emphasized our collective need for answers. He exploited the public's fear, but he also galvanized an enduring community of investigators, both professional and amateur, who refused to let his mystery rest. Countless man-hours, reams of documents, and the continuing efforts of cryptographers stand as a testament to society's resilience and longing for closure. Perhaps one day, a fragment of DNA, a previously unknown confession, or a newly discovered cipher key will provide the final piece to this decades-old puzzle. Until such a resolution arises, the Zodiac Killer remains a symbol of unsolved evil, a warning about how violence can infiltrate seemingly peaceful settings, and how a single individual, wielding both lethal force and public relations savvy, can keep generations enthralled and uneasy. In the final analysis, the case underscores how deeply humans crave explanations for senseless brutality, and how chilling it is when those explanations remain elusive. In the Zodiac's shadow, we see a portrait of a society confronting its own vulnerability, reckoning with the sobering truth that sometimes, despite our best efforts, the unknown may endure. It is this tension between the known and unknown, the rational and irrational, that will likely ensure the Zodiac story remains a potent and unsettling chapter in American criminal history for many years to come. If you enjoyed this content and want to support the channel, don't forget to hit the like button to me. Know you're interested and subscribe so you won't miss any of the latest videos. Thank you so much for watching.